What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to dive into the Explorer meta, kind of figure out what's going on in Explorer, as it is a format that I've been kind of thinking about diving into a little bit more and more here on the channel. Getting an idea of what people are playing, especially the top decks of the meta, is definitely good when it comes to deck building and what decks to maybe play around certain decks that currently exist. But with that being said, let's just dive into the decks and kind of figure out what people are playing. So the first deck up on this list is going to be Abzan Greasefang. This is quite a popular deck currently in the Explorer meta. It's an overall very, very strong deck, as it is kind of one of those combo decks where you get things out on the battlefield much earlier than they normally would be if you paid their actual casting costs. The way we do this is we self-mill ourselves by milling these possible vehicles into our graveyard or making ourselves discard them through various cards that the deck contains. And the idea here is to resolve like an Abzan Greasefang, possibly on curve. And at the beginning of our combat, when this is out on the battlefield, we get to return target vehicle from the graveyard to the battlefield. The vehicle then gains haste, and at the beginning of our next end step is we have to bounce that vehicle back to our hand, and you can get some pretty interesting cards out very, very easily, very cheaply. You get things out like a Seeker's Chariot. You can also get things like Sky Sovereign, as well as the Parhelion. All these cards are definitely very good, and this deck is definitely very strong once you have those pieces in play. It is one of those things, though, if you sometimes don't draw the pieces, it does feel sometimes clunky, but there's enough in the deck to kind of get yourself there, as well as trying to maybe slow down what your opponent's doing or overwhelm them fairly quickly, making this an overall pretty approachable deck in general. The next deck up on this list is going to be Mono Blue Spirits, and this is definitely a very strong tempo deck that exists in the format. It has a lot of creatures that have flash or have some sort of extra value that you can get out of them when they enter the battlefield. You have things like Rattle Change that gives all your other spirits that we control flash as though they had flash, as well as that when it enters the battlefield, you can also give target spirit you control hexproof, which definitely turns off removal spells and things like that. It does have things like Ascendant Spirit as to why we're playing Snowman, as this is probably a really good value spirit for the deck in general, and then has, of course, a Spirit Lord that gives other spirits who control +1/+1. This is definitely a deck to kind of keep an eye out for, especially if you're trying to dive into the meta with a different deck, as this is definitely going to be one of the more frustrating games, as there are a lot of interactions to what your opponent can do against your creatures. But overall, still a pretty decent deck, and not too bad when it comes to overall budget, as it doesn't require a ton of rares and or mythics to really get going. The next deck up on this list is kind of like probably the most frustrating deck to play against, just because there's a ton of triggers that this deck does, and that is Rakdos Sacrifice. Rakdos Sacrifice is a deck that what it's trying to do is trying to get value off of sacrificing things, with things like Cat Familiar being a creature that whenever it enters the battlefield, opponent loses a life, you gain a life, you can sacrifice a food and return from the graveyard to the battlefield. And the way we kind of keep this consistently going in the deck is you play it alongside a card like Witch's Oven, which sacrifices a target creature. If the target creature had toughness 4 or greater, you create 2 food tokens instead. Those food tokens, like I said, can be used for the Cauldron Familiar, and then you essentially build an endless loop there. Combine that with cards like Mayhem Devil being a 4-mana creature that's a 3/3 that every time a player sacrifices a permanent, it deals 1 damage to any target. That also includes your opponent's thing, so if your opponent sacrifices anything on their battlefield, Mayhem Devil is going to also target them with something. So if your opponent has, like, say, a treasure token from their own Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Mayhem Devil is going to do 1 damage to any target that they have. But still, this list is definitely very good, definitely low curved list, as it can get very aggressively very quickly. Has a lot of good cards in it, and as well as cards that steal your opponent's things, and then you're able to maybe sack them to a Witch's Oven or a Village Race to get some extra value. Probably one of the best 1-drop removal spells in all of Magic, and that being Fatal Push. This spell is definitely very strong as well. And overall, just a decently fun list if you're into that sacrifice kind of style gameplay. The next deck up on the list is going to be Azorius Control, and the reason why this list is here is it probably plays one of the better Planeswalkers, especially in what exists currently in MTG Arena, with Teferi Hero Dominaria being a very strong 5-drop Planeswalker that allows us to draw a card in the beginning of the next end step, untap 2 lands, making it essentially only a 3-mana Planeswalker the turn it comes out if you're not using any of the other abilities. Definitely a very strong card there. It plays a card called Shark Typhoon, being a card that can either be a card that you cycle and get a card out of to get a shark token, or if you resolve this spell, every non-creature spell we play, we get a shark token equal to its converted mana cost, and it does play a ton of counter spells and board removal to kind of keep the board as clean as possible so that you can kind of get into that late game. It doesn't play any creatures, so a lot of what it's relying on is what its Planeswalkers can do, and also say things like Shark Typhoon can do to kind of keep the battlefield as clean as possible. But overall, very, very strong control list. If you are someone who's looking to get into control, this is definitely a list to go with, as it's probably the strongest control deck that currently exists in the format. The next deck up on this list is going to be Gruul Midrange. Now, this is actually kind of surprising to me, even when I was looking at the meta overall, as I would think that Gruul Aggro would probably be more of a thing. But Gruul Midrange is definitely a very strong deck, and what it's it's trying to do. What it's really trying to get is to that 4 to 5 drop slot to resolve those bigger, more expensive spells that have a lot of value. You have things like Love Struck Beast. That's a 2-for-1 card where it gets for 1 mana, you get a 1/1 human creature token, which kind of puts it on the battlefield. Or you can spend 3 mana and get a 5/5 that can't attack unless you control a 1/1. It can still block, though, so for 3 mana, getting a 5/5 blocker is definitely very good. Also plays Bone Crusher Giant, 2 mana, deal 2 damage to any target, can't be prevented, or 3 mana for 3 that whenever it becomes target of a spell, it actually deals 2 damage to that spell's controller. Also very strong card. And then on the top end of the deck, you have things like a Seeker's Chariot, creates cat tokens, also can be crewed for 4 power, and it can also then create additional tokens of whatever you copy. It also has Sky Sovereign in it as a card that whenever it attacks, it deals 3 damage to any target creature and/or planeswalker an opponent controls, and only needs to be crewed for 3, and it has flying, and it's a 6/5. But still, nonetheless, this deck list is pretty solid from top to bottom. A little bit on the pricier side because a lot of the rares and mythics are on the top end and in the mana base, but still not a bad deck to check out if you're someone who likes Gruul and likes mid-range style decks. The next deck up on this list is going to be Selesnya Angels, but in reality, it's mostly a mono white Angels deck with a splash of green for 1 card, and that card is Collected Company. The idea here is that we're playing Angel Tribal with most of our Angels being 2 and 3 drops, and what we're trying to do here is trying to gain a bunch of life and then get certain triggers off of certain things. And then at turn 4, we play Collected Company and hopefully hit 2 of these cards out of our library. Overall, very, very strong deck. Definitely gets out of hand very quickly if you ever played against Angels. It's definitely a very frustrating deck to play. It's probably the best life gain deck that currently exists in the Explorer format. And all the cards in general just have tons and tons of value, which definitely makes it also very frustrating. Like I said, the main card of the deck is Collected Company as being that powerful instant speed spell that can get 2 creatures with mana value 3 or less onto the battlefield at instant speed. So you can do it on your opponent's turn, or you can do it on your turn. It doesn't matter. This card is definitely the strongest card probably in the deck. Outside the Angels themselves, this is definitely a very powerful deck. If you like tribal decks, this is probably one of the better tribal decks to play in the meta, but overall, a very, very good deck. Next deck up on the list is going to be Mono Red Burn, and this is definitely a solid deck choice if you're looking for some quick aggro action, as Burn can be one of those explosive decks that exists currently in the Explorer format, has access to all the cheap burn spells that deals direct damage to your opponent's face, as well as some of the best aggressive creatures in the format as well, with things like Monetary Swift Spear, Phoenix Chicks being very solid 1-drops, as well as it has things that get cheaper if we deal damage to our opponent's face, with things like Skewer the Critics, as well as Light Up the Stage, both being cards that have the Spectacle ability that if we dealt damage to our opponent's life, we can pay 1 mana and get the trigger of that said ability. So overall, very, very solid deck, and definitely a very punishing deck that definitely punishes the slower decks of the format, making this a reason why this deck is closer to the top of the meta in general. And the one other benefit of the deck, it's not the most expensive deck. It does contain rares and does contain mythics, but if you've been playing a lot of standard, there's not too many rares and mythics from other sets you really need to acquire to really build this deck. The next deck up on this list is going to be Mono White Humans. Mono White Humans is definitely a very strong deck in the meta. It's plays some of the best cards that have tons of value built into them. It's a deck that doesn't need to play any non-creature spells to really be competitive, as all the creatures that this deck contains has some sort of extra value into them, whether it's cards that help you get rid of things on the battlefield with things like Brutal Cathar, has things like Adeline, which produces tokens. It gets stronger the more creatures you have on the battlefield. Or you have Thalia's Lieutenant, which is in general blankets, puts +1/+1 counters to each other human you control, and then it gets +1/+1 every time a creature comes in the battlefield under our control, which is definitely very strong for this deck. Definitely a very, very strong deck. Definitely on the cheaper side when it comes to overall casting cost of things. It doesn't play anything bigger than 3 mana, so this is definitely a deck that doesn't need a ton of mana to really be competitive. But overall, very, very strong deck. Also very quick aggro deck. Can really finish off games relatively quickly if you hit the right cards in general. And the final deck on this list is going to be Mono Green Devotion. And Mono Green Devotion is probably one of the more popular decks, as well as probably one of the best decks currently in Explorer. Not only because it has a lot of powerful spells for relatively cheap mana costs, it has access to a card called Nykthos, Shrine of Nyx, a card that got introduced with the most recent Explorer Anthology, a card that allows us to add mana to our mana pool based on a particular color we choose. And green usually has some of the best cards that has tons of cards of that mana value symbol in its casting cost. So this is definitely a deck that can play some really big explosive spells relatively early in the game. Having access to like Storm of the Festival on like turn 3 or 4 is definitely very good, in the sense that you're playing a 6 mana spell relatively early, and then there's a good chance you could also probably flash it back probably on the next turn if you hit the right things off the top cards of your library. Very solid deck from top to bottom. Very powerful deck. Just like I said, there's a lot of spells that are on the cheaper side, like Love Struck Beast, Old Gold Troll, both being very solid 3-drops that can add devotion and add power to the battlefield relatively quickly. And this deck has very solid ramp to kind of get yourself there. Combine that with things like Kiora, which untaps lands, to kind of then maybe use them to make more lands, so you can untap a Nykthos, to then tap the Nykthos again to get even more mana, which is definitely very good. This deck is, like I said, very solid from top to bottom. And Nykthos just kind of helps this deck kind of flourish even more just because it makes it even more powerful and explosive than normally it would be if it didn't have Nykthos. Very solid deck. Definitely a deck to keep your eye out for just because this deck is lurking around in the format and definitely on the cheaper side when it comes to rares and mythics. It does require to play. And that's going to be the list. I mean, overall, all these decks are definitely very good, very explosive. These are just the top 10 decks based on meta share that are in currently Explorer, but there's probably hundreds of decks that you could choose from and actually have still viable options. I'll have a link for all these decks down in the description below, as well as it also will have options to see the other decks people are playing outside of the top 10. But if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're someone who plays Explorer, let me know in the comments below what you think overall of the format, and if you're someone who can't wait until it gets fully fledged out into Pioneer. If you're new here, you want to know post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video.